Good morning. It is May 4th, Saturday, doing my second universe writer's update a day late. Normally it's Friday morning, doing a writing tip about Isekai and what it can teach me. Isekai is the Japanese anime genre, manga subgenre, Trapped in Another World, Alice in Wonderland. Game session update, have a ally non-player character that may be an antagonist, may really be an enemy in disguise, but it's complicated. So I'll dive into that, give some background and explanation, and then a little story time. The dream behind the dream. What was the muse many decades ago for the collection of stories that I've woven together into a tapestry of fiction. So, Isekai is very popular. I think it will supplant what's currently the young adult fiction wave of. So let me back up a little bit. There was a wave of dystopian young adult fiction, like a love triangle in a dystopian setting, usually with a heroine. Things like ones that rose to the top were the Hunger Games is probably the biggest one, but a number. Often there was a love triangle. It was usually in a dystopian setting, post-apocalyptic or some kind of thing. You have teenagers battling it out in this harsh environment, coming together, doing the whole high school cliche thing, but in a dystopian setting. That wave seems to have passed and settled down, and we're currently in a wave of social justice fiction. So, and the same basic stories, but with the slant of, oh, this person is part of this identity group that's being repressed in some way, and they're a fish out of water. They're put into an environment where they're treated less than, and they overcome that obstacle and something romantic formula. I believe the next will be what is popular coming out of Japan, it's called the Isekai, different world. It's basically someone gets transported to another world. So Alice in Wonderland is transported to another world, gets trapped in a video game, goes into a video game purposefully, but the video game is a virtual reality headset, and then the story is, at least in part or mostly, in that virtual setting. I think that will be the next wave for young adult fiction, and then will translate into a series of movies. Ready Player One touched upon that interest, the movie, but I think it'll become much more dominant. I think it's a natural transition from the superhero movie dominance. Though I think for the superhero movies, there's going to be twisting to a little darker side of what superheroes can be. They've already done it with The Watchmen. They're doing it with The Boys, which is I believe it's going to be on Amazon, Amazon Prime, based on the comic with the same name, where it shows if people really had these superpowers, that they could be just on the surface good, but underneath truly horrible people. So kind of playing around with that genre of superheroes. I think that'll kind of keep the interest in superheroes for a bit, but ultimately, I think the Isekai genre will supplant superheroes in the next 5 years or so. But definitely in young adult fiction, I think it'll be the new wave. Certainly, it is the most popular anime genre that's being watched, and or subgenre, and it makes a lot of sense. It's a familiar. It's taking you, someone that you identify with, whoever you are, like high schooler, present day, or near future, a person that is relatable. You understand the world that they're from, and they're put into a fantastical place. And this fantastical place is also somewhat familiar because of the prevalence of the fantasy tropes, the Dungeons and Dragons, the Lord of the Rings standard. There's kind of like a stamp of universality. The mythologies have kind of come together in a somewhat familiar way. So it's a fantastical setting, but it's kind of familiar, and that eases things as well. And then they work to overcome that, all the things that, and build up like a video game, or it may actually be a video game that has been given some twist, some extra life, and there's always going to be some twist. Some of the popular ones, Sword Art Online, is near the top of the list, if not at the top, where someone or where a group of people get trapped in this virtual reality massive multiplayer role-playing game, and if they die, they die in the real world. If they die in the game, they die in the real world. So that's a twist, at least in the first season. Um, then there's one called Overlord, where somebody gets transported to the video game world, and the twist is that he is the bad guy. And there's many different versions. There's ReZero, where someone is transported to a fantasy world from the real world, and or from another world, from his world, and when he dies, he comes back to life, and time is reset a bit, so he kind of learns this in this hard way. There's many good ones. The three I mentioned, I like all three. I'm currently watching Rising of a Shield Hero, and it has its own little twist. But basically, what I'm trying to do with my writing is on hard mode. This Isekai is kind of on easy mode. I'm trying to do something a little harder because I'm writing from my point of view characters are writing from within the sci-fi or fantasy setting. It's not a they have the characters, they are familiar with that world. They aren't familiar with our world. So I don't have that bridge. I have to get readers comfortable with that world so they can identify. It's harder to get people comfortable with a character that has such a different life experience than them. So, for example, Hildur, for my main character for my current book, she doesn't relate to our world in a lot of ways, but so I emphasize ways that she does. So she's pregnant, or she believes that she's pregnant, so I emphasize that some of the thoughts that she's going through her head about being pregnant, and she has a different idea of any number of issues, and it's the little things, how she eats, what is she, those whenever what she wears, like these little things, try to connect readers with her and identify and care about her and her decisions. But it's an uphill battle. It's compared to Isekai. So how can I compete? And I need to look at Isekai and how it's succeeding and seeing what I can incorporate. I don't want to just copy and throw somebody from our world into my setting. It doesn't fit. I think it's a bit of a cheap way of doing things. But it's kind of the dream behind the dream. So skipping over Pipit and Tipit, the game session for a second, going into the story time. I had, as a kid, this idea of a generation spaceship being a ship that takes more than one generation to travel from one place to another, and just in general being in or a cryogenic sleep of some kind, just these journeys that would take years or generations, and how to occupy the mind during that time. And I played around with some ideas of going into a virtual reality setting during this time and what that could be like, or even living a whole life while in a cryogenic sleep. And then at the end, you would remember that when you would die in that virtual life, you would remember the lives that you lived before, and this kind of pairing of science fiction and afterlife and religion. And that was, and I would think about it when I was going to sleep, and I would kind of dive into a dream. And this was the dream behind the dream of my fiction. And I played around with these ideas, and I think the Isekai genre is doing the same thing. I think we all imagine ourselves in different settings. It's part of being human. We think of, oh, what would my life be like if I was this or that? If I had a different career, if I lived in a different place, if I moved to Japan, which I did briefly. It is a very human story, and this lesson that I'm teaching myself about Isekai and its success is returning me to my earliest thoughts about writing and fiction, about what inspired me at the very beginning. So it's a good thing. Whenever you see success in a field that you want to be successful for, learn from it. You can, don't just dismiss. Don't just think I am better than 50 Shades of Grey. Understand and accept that it is successful, and learn. How can you as a writer, how can you as a creator draw upon what they were successful with, and make your own work more successful? So that's my thought process. So the game session, for my virtual tabletop role-playing game that I manage, that I facilitate, there is a character, Pipit, and then I flip the name around, and then there's a character, Tipip, and they share the same mind. The character's mind has been split, or at least that's what's been reported to the characters right now. This is the information that they have. It's not necessarily true, but they're presented with this possibility of one of their greatest allies they lean on a great deal as having a split mind, and one personality is helpful and the other personality has interests which seem to be at odds with the party, and the party is considering options. It's a twist at this stage. They're well on their way to establishing a regional power in controlling a number of settlements and negotiating with other regional powers. So to have this internal problem is interesting. This last session, I had them strap on their swords and shields and dance with their fingers, casting some magic, just to get. It was maybe a bit too much role playing, so get back down to basics, and then for upcoming Sunday money sessions, they're going to have to deal, I think, with this realization of a internal, or within their group, problem with Pipit. And yeah, so that went on a bit long. If you guys have any questions about my process, I'm happy to share and have a conversation. Just let me know, and see you next week.